Okay, let's get started. So, hi everyone, this is Caron Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. Thanks for joining us for this webinar on getting biking and walking projects into transportation plans. The webinar is being run as a Zoom meeting, so I'm going to ask that you please put yourself on mute and stay muted until we get to the Q&A section at the end of the presentations. But feel free to add questions and comments into the chat as we go along. And I wanted to do this webinar because now that the bipartisan infrastructure law has passed, there will be hundreds of millions of dollars for transportation projects flowing into states and metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs. And it will be the decision makers in those states and MPOs who will be making the long-term decisions on how the funding will be spent and how it will shape our transportation systems and our communities for years to come. And those decisions will start through the planning process. And if we want bicycling and walking to be better represented in those plans, we need to understand the process and how to promote projects within it. So today we'll hear from an advocacy, a local government, and an MPO perspective about how the planning process works and how advocates can best engage. So I'd like to first introduce our panelists. Sarah Clark Stewart is the Executive Director of the Bicycle Coalition of Greater Philadelphia. Her leadership led to several of the Bicycle Coalition's key accomplishments, conceiving the proposal that led to a $23 million Tiger Trail grant. She has lobbied successfully for Philly's Complete Streets policy, for legislation mandating the inclusion of bike parking in new construction projects, and for Philadelphia's Vision Zero goal to eliminate traffic deaths by 2030. Next, we'll have Scott Jarvis. Scott is a senior engineer with 26 years of experience with the city of Henderson, Nevada, where he manages the city's capital improvements program and the design team, which is responsible for delivering 50 million worth of improvements in the average year. He was the lead for developing the city's Complete Streets policy and in earning recognition as a silver level bicycle friendly community, and serves as the staff representative with the city's Bicycle Advisory Committee. And then we'll have Byron Rushing, who is a planner at the Atlanta Regional Commission, which is the MPO for the Atlanta region. And he focuses on walking, bicycling, trails, and livable communities. He has degrees from Georgia Tech and Vanderbilt University, and is the former president of the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals. And he will be joined by Tejas Kotak, who's a senior transportation planner at the Atlanta Regional Commission, where he manages their TIP evaluation, their Transportation Improvement Plan evaluation. So before I turn it over to Sarah, I'm just quickly going to turn to Tejas to answer one question, which is, can you tell us a little bit about what a transportation plan is and how it works?
Sure, thank you. And just a quick clarification, my name is pronounced Tejas, like the word advantageous.
Sorry about that.
No, totally fine. Yeah, so the Transportation Improvement Program is something that every MPO throughout the country is in charge of helping local communities plan and administer. It typically focuses on shorter range transportation projects, so projects that are in the 1 to 6 year time period that those local governments and communities are actively planning to advance. So any phase of those projects, whether it is design, right-of-way, getting the right-of-way and utility permits, or the active construction of it. And these projects could be funded in any number of ways, fully funded locally with state dollars, with federal dollars, and MPOs are in charge of helping to administer those, make sure they're delivered on time, and to track any changes that local governments have in terms of the phasing and financing of those programs. ARC has discretion over a certain number of federal funds, and our local governments apply to us to get those buckets of funding to help to finance their local projects. So as a very broad overview of what the TIP is, that is one definition for it.
All right, thanks so much. With that, I'm going to turn it to Sarah.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Sarah Clark Stewart, and I'm going to open my share my screen, and go through a few slides. So what I'm going to try and talk to you about is um, basically the story behind getting a project on the tip and the Pennsylvania tip. And so it sort of guides you through kind of the various things that we have done as an advocacy group to get that accomplished. And I just, one important thing is that I'm both executive director of the Bicycle Coalition. I'm also chair of a coalition. And the coalition works on the region's trail network, the off-road trail network, and something that we got launched in the early 2000s. And so this is by no means the work of only one group. It's really a huge effort of many, over 50 different organizations. So one of the first things that we did was the idea of the circuit is that it's about 800 miles and in 2013 it was only about 750 miles, but of off-road trails all connected together, and that were of a certain criteria. And we worked to get the idea of this network into the long-term plan. So metropolitan planning organizations have to put out a long-term plan every 3 to 4 or 5 years. And it's kind of a guidebook of how it expects to be spending money in the future. And it has a long time frame, like 30 years. So it can be pretty aspirational, but it does help set goalposts for then what the transportation improvement programs, the TIPs, that are amended all the time, have to sort of comport with, right? So we got it in, so we got the idea of building out the circuit by 2040 in this particular plan, which was adopted in 2013. And our metropolitan planning organization has staff, but it's also it's really run by, the board members are county commissioners. And so they are essentially saying to all the people who live in the region, this is how we're going to spend money and this is how we're going to allocate it. And it's mostly transportation money between roads and bridges, bicycle and pedestrian projects, transit, etc. So once we got it in there, then we started to point to it and say, you said you were going to do it, so you have to actually start spending money in order to build it out. One of the first things we did was we asked for particular projects to be put into the TIP, and what they came up with was creating one line item that 7 projects could be put into that one line item, and they allocated about $5 million of, I think, TAP money as sort of a down payment. Like, here's $5 million. We know these 7 projects will cost a lot more than that, but once you start actually needing the money, you can come in and start tapping into it. And the fact that these were now in there, they had what's called an MPMS number. I forget what that stands for, but it's very important. And Spring Garden Street, which I'm going to talk about, has this now number, which is part of the line item. So that was huge, and that happened in 2015. We then, I'm trying to move forward, and it's not letting me. I don't know why. Oh, here we go. Then we started to break down and work on figuring out every single segment of trails that needed to be built as a way to help understand what was the sort of universe of segments that was going to actually get us to building it out. And we did it by county. We have 9 counties in our region, pretty complicated, and then we started in an advocacy kind of way, we started creating action teams around every single county. So we have 9 action teams, and they focus on a couple of the projects. Why this won't go? Here we go. So Spring Garden Street has its own action team, and we did things like have a petition to show that there's a tremendous amount of public support. It's a trail, but it's really a complete street project. It's a 4-lane, or in some cases 5-lane street that goes from river to river. It's in terrible condition, and this is a whole way, just a fantastic way to make it safe for bicyclists and pedestrians and better for motorists. So and as part of that action team, they actually helped gin up a lot of support for an earmark, which didn't happen in the past last summer. We also helped the city apply for a RAISE grant to do the planning, because this is a big project. It's like $60 million. That also didn't work. But then we turned our attention to the next long-term plan, which was passed this past August. And the reason I point this out is that this is really important to know that they break out the different kinds of buckets of how they want to spend money. And what they said here was, we want to spend about between our New Jersey counties and our Pennsylvania counties, 4.5% of how much money we spend over the next 30 years on bicycle and pedestrian projects. This was twice as big as what they had been doing before. So we said, okay, that's another thing that we're going to hold you to. You need to be spending about $1.36 billion over the next 29 years on bicycle pedestrian projects. And if that's the case, then you should be spending about $40 to $50 million a year on the tip for bicycle pedestrian projects. And my big point here is, you're not going to do that with only TAP and CMAQ. You need to be spending surface transportation or highway money on bicycle and pedestrian projects in order to meet the goals that were set out in this long-term plan and adopted by the MPO board. So this is just a little highlight. Spring Garden Street is this. It's this river to river from the Delaware to the Schuylkill complete street trail project. It's part of the East Coast Greenway, which is critical. And this, whatever's in blue here, is not built, and that's what we're trying to do, is make sure we can find the money and do as much as possible, especially for these big expensive projects, to put them on the tip so that they can access enough money to actually get done. And this is another kind of rendering of what Spring Garden Street Greenway will look like. So that's my presentation. Thanks. I'll stop here.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So a real lesson for you is getting into a long range plan so that every consecutive plan.
Right. It's because once it's in the long-term plan, then you have enough money, or there should be enough money to be spending. Then getting it onto the tip is, I guess I sort of missed a lot of that, but is really about making the case for these various projects and then getting the county officials, the commissioners, to really support putting them onto the tip so that they can access federal funds. It sounds very simple to sort of go to the elected official and they, frequently will say, sure, that sounds like a good idea. It really requires getting the transportation planners, the county officials, the agency folks who work for the elected officials. They need to be bought into this. They are really the gatekeepers for how all the money is spent, and they have a long list of road projects that they have been working on for 10, 20, 30 years. That's their priority. And so getting in with bike ped projects and getting your foot in the door is very hard. But making the case by making sure it's in the long-term plan, making the case that there's public support and that it's part of a network, whether it's a bike lane network or a sidewalk network, or whatever it is, you have all the reasons for why it's important. But it's really getting the official kind of buy-in by those decision makers.
All right, thank you. Thanks. And with that, I'll turn it to Scott.
Great. I will try to share my screen here quickly. And bear with me, everybody, in case I do it wrong. I've done that before. Can you? I'm getting the note out that only the host can share screen.
Yeah, you should be. I'm sorry, you should be a co-host. Oh, yeah, we were viewing your screen, but it was still in, like we could see the future slides on the side. It was still in the work mode.
There we go. Everybody bear with me for 1 second. And I believe I got it right this time, or
Yes,
no?
we can see it. Thanks.
Are you seeing my slides advancing just to make sure?
Yes.
I'm getting thumbs up. Great, thank you. Everybody, West Coast, good morning. I understand we're getting close to lunchtime, so I will try to be entertaining because if you're like me, you're getting hungry. East Coast, Midwest, folks, I realize you've already eaten lunch. And if I'm not entertaining, I might put you to sleep. And I definitely do not want to do that. As Karen identified, I am an engineer at the city of Henderson. I've been an engineer for decades. I am also an advocate, very passionate about this. And I understand a lot of what you're going to hear today is going to be incredibly confusing. I am lucky. I do this for my job. I get paid to do it. And I've been doing it for years, and there's still elements that confuse me. One of the biggest takeaways you might get from today is every jurisdiction where you live is different. How the MPO functions in your particular state or county or region might not be how the MPO functions in my area. So the biggest thing I want to leave with you is you need to make connections. You need to get to know people, and you need to ask questions so you can get more informed of who are the decision makers, who are the team players, and where's the right place for you to emphasize your efforts. Hopefully you see my second screen advanced. Where do projects come from? Awesome. Once again, I have dual monitors going here. So one monitor is showing one thing and the second one showing something else, and it's confusing me. Projects, as you can see in here, master planning. That is something that was touched upon a little earlier by Sarah. Great thing. For me, I'm the day-to-day in the weeds, local government. So our job is to implement master plans. Another thing I have going on is safety concerns. We have projects where they come out of nowhere because there was a fatality. And then we look into it, we identify concerns and say, what can we do to make geometric changes? One of the big things for us is maintaining infrastructure. Today, you're going to hear a lot about money, all this money that's coming. To put it very generically, there are different pots of money, and that money comes in various flavors. Each flavor has restrictions on how it can be spent. There are local monies, there are state monies, there are federal pass-through monies. Each one of those come with different caveats of what you can use it for. So that is something that you really need to get in tune with is when you're looking at a project, what is the available flavor of money that might be used for it, and what are the strings that come attached with it. Obviously, hopefully you can see on my slide and got a couple chuckles out of you from my second from the bottom, from riding my bike. Honestly, with my role of identifying projects and what we are going to do as a jurisdiction in the near future, I get an incredible perspective from riding my bike around town and also riding our trail system. I can identify where the gaps are at. I can look at where our pavement is starting to have concerns. And it's a much different perspective, as you all know, from sitting in a car. And then the bottom thing I put on here is advocates. Advocates are essential.
Scott, we're still seeing the where do projects come from?
How about now? You see my next screen, which
Yeah.
is show you speak my language?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Something that's very critical in understanding projects is as you're advocating for projects, engineers and planners do not speak the same language. Engineers and planners and advocates do not speak the same language. So there's a responsibility by all to try to get together and understand what we are looking for and what we're meaning. The big thing to understand of when I'm looking to get a project into my local tip, I have to understand the funding, but I also have to understand what long-range plan that I am trying to be in compliance with. This can get very confusing. In my local area, as you can see on my screen, in the last 4 years, there's been 34 planning studies completed. That is thousands of pages of reading, but it's like everything else. Take it one bite at a time. Get involved now, get familiar with these things so you know what the long range concepts are. That is what we do as local government. So we look at opportunities to align with regional goals and values. This slide, the best thing to take out of here is what we do at local government and also at the regional level. We think long term. 2050, that is the current regional transportation plan in the area that I live. We are planning out till 2050. Well, that means things in 2050 are very, very fluid. Things in 2021, 2022 are pretty set. 2021 should be under construction already. So one thing to do as you're looking to get projects into the tip is look at what's already in there and see if there's an opportunity to expand that project and include an element that hasn't been thought about, especially if it's bike or ped. Timing. Do the right thing at the right time for the right reason. That is what we try to do as a local government. So what advocates can leverage that with is understand where we are at local government wise in the process and do everything you can to come in at a time when your input is the most valuable. If you look at a project life cycle, you get into the first thing, identifying. This is once the planning has already taken place, once it's already in the tip, and it hits my team's desk to say, all right, it's time to move it forward. We know what a big picture need is, what concerns we want to address from the lens we look at it from engineers. We identify a budget. We say, okay, let's go into the design. Honestly, that is the least advantageous time for you to come forward as an advocate and say, I want to change. Because at this point in time, this project's already been on the books for years. We've already moved it forward. We've started doing something, and we realize it's going to take us months or years to get to the design process, depending upon how complicated it is. At this time also, there's also a lot of pressure placed on us internally from different departments and obviously political reasons of get this project done, get it into construction. So major additions to our project at the last minute are very hard for us to accommodate. But if there's a concept brought in early on, back in the planning process, that's what shapes the project, that's what shapes the funding. This is a major corridor in my city. We actually received an info grant because of it. We received 40 million. It's going to become a $120 million project. But I throw this up here just as an advocate is everybody, obviously you look at this picture from your lens and you probably have general ideas or thoughts of, wow, what could we do different? This was constructed in 1931. The world has changed drastically since then and we do things differently. But as you look at this from the engineer lens, you can see kind of the items I've listed off to the side. These are the things that we consider in terms of an overall project. And that is the value then as an advocate of getting in early, getting in relationships, so that as you start to identify, hey, these are things that we need from bicycling. This is how it ties into your master plan. I understand some of the constraints from your engineering world. Where can we meet in the middle? One thing I want to touch upon is under the theme of timing is, in my career, I've seen a lot of successes and failures. The picture in the bottom left hand corner is the Pittman Wash. So obviously I'm in the desert Southwest. It's hot, it's dry, there's not a lot of vegetation. We've been in extreme drought for over a decade. We do have this urban greenbelt oasis that goes for several miles across our jurisdiction. We have a trail system through there, and that is the bottom left-hand picture. The top picture shows what happens when it rains, and you can kind of see the wash off in the left-hand picture of the rain from in the photo, and you can see the water in the wash. What you probably noticed too is, yeah, it's a trail, that's great, but why in the heck is there a curb there on the right-hand side? Because a cyclist, we know that's the worst thing in the world. Who wants a curb next to your pedal? Well, this trail came to be because of advocacy. And so because of those efforts we put in, we received funding through a grant process, and we were able to build the trail. At that point in time, there was concern that we didn't want to build any trail lights on it to light it because adjacent to the trail is the backyard of residents. And the residents, as advocates, were very adamant, we don't want lights in our backyards. So no lights were put in originally. Years later, the trail was brought to fruition, is very successful, and advocacy then changed. And there was more people who said, we really want lights back here, we need lights. And so somebody at the local government looked into it and said, okay, let's put in for some opportunities to put in lighting. And they did that. And then it came and it was delivered to the engineering world, said, all right, install the trail lighting. Unfortunately, the funding that was put into place to do the lighting was insufficient to do it the best way possible. And so it ended up, because of the constraints, geometric constraints, the lighting had to go on the right-hand side of the trail, as you can see in the picture. Because of the footing for the walls for the homes underground, we could not bury the conduit to power the lights. So that curb you see, which is the most obnoxious thing in the world to a bicyclist, actually holds the power conduit to turn the lights on. So for me, this is both an advocacy success and a failure in that the project went in phases over years and good things came out of it, but because of advocacy and engineering and planning not being forward thinking enough, we ended up with this end condition. So probably the thing I'd like to leave you with more than anything is, as you're looking at getting projects in the tip, in my particular jurisdiction, talk to the local government, see what we have going on, look for opportunities to expand on projects we already have, but also look at it from the lens and the understanding of you are not the only advocate. We have multiple concerns, multiple people with needs coming at us, and honestly, our budgets are just like your personal checkbooks. You have a lot of needs, you have a lot of wants, and you probably don't have enough money to make it all work. And so it's always a balance of what moves forward first. So being involved early, being in line with existing plans, helping shape what future plans look like are all keys. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. So thanks, Scott. You talked about getting in early. How would an advocate know when to get involved?
Well, I'll start with, it's never too late, because the idea you have today might not fit with a current project, but it might give us the genesis for a new project. And in terms of when getting in early, government's complicated, it really is. We have all sorts of regulations that we have to follow. So we post things on our webpage. If you are not familiar with the local government webpage, please go there. Whenever we are updating a master plan, it's posted. It goes out and it says, we are looking for comments. We're looking for stakeholders. That happens both the regional level and the local level. And I'll give you a little insight. If you get to know the local staff and you start making comments, next time you won't have to watch the webpage. They'll reach out and ask you to be part of it, because they're always looking for informed people who are looking to better the community.
All right, great tip. Okay, thanks, Scott. And I'll turn it over to Byron.
Great, thank you, Karen. Thank you for having us today. So as Karen mentioned, I'm Byron Russian. I'm a planner at the Atlanta Regional Commission. And I'm going to talk through a little bit about who and what we are at the MPO. And then I'm going to hand it off to Tejas to talk a little bit about specifically how we build the tip. And I want to echo Scott's point that MPOs are federally designated, they're federally created, but every one is the product of its own local history and politics. And so our context in Metro Atlanta has changed dramatically over the past 20 years, and our process reflects that. So this is not a how-to for your MPO, but it is kind of a broad look at what MPOs are and maybe why they're important to get involved with. And if you haven't read The Next American Metropolis, it's one of my favorite books, and Peter Calthorpe really talks eloquently about the fact that modern cities are really regional entities. And I think it's a bit challenging for us as people who think about walking and bicycling because the scale doesn't always match. MPOs are a product of auto and highway investments. And a lot of people, especially in metropolitan Atlanta, where driving is so prevalent, live across that entire region. So trying to wedge bike and ped projects both into the geography as well as to the process can be awkward. MPOs are not designed to support walking and bicycling. And so trying to figure out where they fit into that process can be challenging. But this is who we are. I chuckled at Sarah's comment that they have 9 counties that are a little bit complicated. We have 20 full counties and pieces of several others. Now in Georgia, we have very small counties. So for West Coast folks, you know, this may be 1 county's worth of area, but for us, it's 20 county commissioners as elected officials and just over 90 incorporated cities with all the mayors who are our core constituent. And technically our MPO is a state created membership association. So our counties are dues paying members and they're the main source of our income. So when we're having a political conversation, the counties are always kind of first in that conversation, and then cities, and then other local communities, just in the way that we kind of approach conversations. But this is the main question that I've been trying to answer during my time at ARC. How do we as a region build a transportation system where it's easier and safer for everyone to walk or bike? For such a big region, we've really found that one of the key answers is diversity. We have some wonderful greenway trails, including the longest in the Southeast. We have some very concentrated downtown business districts that have a lot of walking trips, all supported by transit. And then we have lots and lots and lots of suburban residential areas where walking and biking trips are not likely to be feasible on a daily basis, but they might pair well with either a new transit investment or a greenway trail or some of their combinations. So we really see it as there's not one solution for the entire region, and it's really critical to how we approach both our long range plan as well as the product that comes out of that in the tip. Tejas touched on it briefly at the very beginning, but an MPO is essentially the local liaison between the federal government. Congress gives money to the U.S. Department of Transportation. Some of that money is directly sent to the MPO to be allocated locally, and some of it comes through the state, and there's some money that the state has control over that we have influence over, and it gets very complicated after that. But you can really think of an MPO as being this local voice that sits between the federal, state, and local governments and tries to work all that out. Our MPO, as I mentioned, is made up of 20 counties, and every county commissioner has an automatic seat on our MPO board. And then we have 5 mayors that rotate through. So with 90 cities, your particular city may not always have a mayor who's represented on the board. It may be the next mayor over, next town over, which always results in an interesting political conversation. We have a handful of citizen members that get nominated by board members to join us. And then we also have seats for our major state and regional entities, our transit agency, our State Department of Transportation, and several other groups. So that is a complicated group of folks to work with, and it is a very diverse and wide range of perspectives with county commissioners that represent agricultural, farmland, rural areas, and county commissioners and mayors who represent downtown Atlanta and the central business district. And we have to have conversations with each of them and build a long range plan that represents all of their needs. In Metro Atlanta in particular, and every MPO has to have both a long range transportation plan as well as a TIP. But the way that we build it is the Atlanta Region's plan is our long range transportation plan that gets accumulated out of smaller local plans. We fund a county transportation plan for every county once every 5 years. And we really intend for that local county plan to feed into building the list that we represent in the long range transportation plan. And then when projects are in the RTP, that is typically for us a 30 or 40 year horizon. And we don't have specific money allocated the entire way out. So we know that the long range transportation plan should have about this much money, but 30 or 40 years from now, it's hard to predict. So the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Program, is the immediate next 6 years. So once we get to the edge of that project, when it's going to be built, it migrates from the long range transportation plan into the TIP. And then ultimately into our Unified Planning Work Program, which is what we're going to be doing the next immediate year. So as I think Scott mentioned, it can be very confusing, and it can be very hard for advocates to know which conversation they're having. And it can be very hard for neighbors to really project out to say what they want to be in 30 years. As I mentioned, MPOs are not particularly well suited to walking and biking projects. So a very small sidewalk that could be really, really critical for a transit connection is kind of cast against, you know, a 30-year interstate freeway expansion or interchange, and that can be a hard scale to manage. But it is important to understand our process and when each of these plans comes up for discussion or renewal, and be present at them, because as I think Sarah really demonstrated, a conversation in the Atlanta Regions Plan around equity or mobility can really pay off dividends years down the road. When it gets time to fund the TIP, we can draw back from the good projects that were and the good programs that were supported earlier on. When I talk about the way that we function, I really have two kind of critical levels of responsibility. Our MPO with a regional focus allocates federal funding, prioritizes projects, which Pages is going to talk through the process for how we do that technically. And then provide a lot of technical assistance for our communities. With 90 cities, they vary widely in their staff skills and expertise. So there's a lot of cities that we kind of provide technical support or research support or moral support to try to kind of get them into this process and through it. Equity in this process is an enormous issue, and one that we're still really grappling with. Cities and counties that have the resources to participate in this very long and often very dull process versus those who are, you know, they don't need something from us constantly, so they have to relearn the process every time they arrive. And then there's a local focus about project scoping and project delivery, as Scott mentioned. As a engineer who works for a local city, it's really on him to identify those projects, nominate them for funding through the regional process, but then ultimately shepherd them through the project development process. And I always make the point that we as an MPO can't program a good TIP if we're not getting good projects into it. As Caron said, you know, whoever shows up to really ask for that money is kind of what gets represented in the TIP. And we go through phases of the TIP being very forward-looking and very equitable and very supportive. And then other times when, you know, we're trying to sort through tons and tons of freeway projects. And then, like I mentioned, toolkit for implementation, and really the idea that cities need to kind of be building their knowledge and expertise base. So that's the long-range transportation plan and how it feeds into the TIP. Pages is going to show us how the TIP develops. I wanted to talk briefly about how we specifically approach walking and bicycling, because I think that's a great area for us, for advocates to be involved in. We do a lot with data. We do a lot of research at our agency. We're blessed as an agency to have an independent kind of research wing that lives in our agency. And so we have lots of access to census data and regional modeling and computer models and simulations and things. I've spent a lot of time over my time at ARC trying to pivot a lot of that data to be more supportive of how we want walking and bicycling to be funded and to be prioritized. Looking at heat maps of where things are likely to occur in the region, looking at safety questions, looking at equity and how equity plays out in funding. And this is an area we don't look at this data routinely every year, but every couple of years when we go back to revisit our regional walking and bicycling vision, this is a great place to have advocates both support what I'm trying to do, but also teach me and highlight things that we didn't do right last time that we need to improve on. We spend a lot of time trying to talk to people. We have an enormous diversity of people in metropolitan Atlanta who are not always well represented in the traditional transportation planning and funding discussions. So one of the things we try to do is kind of lift up some of these voices and say, walking trips or transit trips or bicycling trips work really well for so many people in metropolitan Atlanta who have been, who aren't able to drive or had their mobility options limited. And so it's really a place for us to kind of be institutional and professional advocates for better outcomes. We do a lot of work with community development because, again, at that scale of the metropolitan region, a bicycling trip doesn't always make sense across counties, or certainly not across 20 counties. And so how can we really start to influence local decisions? We can't make zoning decisions. We can't make development decisions, but we have tools that we can use to try to kind of spur better development and better growth and better connections at a very local level. It's also very hard for us as a region to talk about every single sidewalk that would be great or every single bike lane segment that would be great. So we try to develop programs for how to kind of share that information or do that in conjunction with our local partners. And I won't go into it on this, but we have a program called our Livable Centers Initiative, which is the way that we direct federal transportation money into better community-oriented design and transportation design. And that's a very interesting program that we do a little bit differently than some other regions do. And then, as Sarah mentioned, there is a scale at which bicycling makes a lot of sense in our metro region, and that's really through our multi-use paths and greenways network. And I think of these as kind of our bike and ped superhighways, and really looking at those big connections that work well across the region. And if you see in this kind of cartoon map, there's not a lot of detail in that, but it really helps us communicate the idea that somebody can get on the Silver Comet Trail, cross over across the perimeter highway and into our Atlanta Beltline urban downtown rail trail. And so we do a lot of thinking at this kind of big macro scale from which we can draw very specific projects. And there's several, even looking at this map, there's several of those yellow wedges that need to get updated. And there's several that have been persistent problems for me over my career, and we're looking forward to getting them closed. So again, trying to kind of cast this big vision. And this is an excellent area for advocates to get involved when we're creating these big maps. One, it's fun to work with maps, but also we try as much as possible to draw projects directly from this map. We would love for the tip to not ever have a new project in it. We want the tip to reflect projects that have had some ongoing development and conversations. So having conversations at this scale is so helpful, even if that tip is going to get built 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 years later. Having this to work from and knowing that there's been a basic conversations to think about that is very helpful. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and hand it over to Tejas. Scott talked a little bit about project development. We don't do a lot of that, but we do try to really elevate proven safety countermeasures when we do funding. So pet hybrid beacons and protected bike lanes and greenway trails and medians, and many other ones that when we talk about funding projects, we want them all to be safe and convenient for everyone. So we try to do our part to use our funding as a tool to nudge that direction. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tejas to talk through how the actual tip process works. And Tejas, just like move the slides forward for you.
Thanks, Byron. So I want to talk about a framework we have developed, a key decision point framework to evaluate projects that are submitted to us. So 2 or 3 years, we have an open call for projects from our cities, our counties, our quasi-governmental business groups, and all of our regional and state level transit and transportation agencies. So we open up that universal tip project call. We get all of their applications in over a period of several months. Then we start putting them through this KDP filter system. So first is key decision point 1, policy filters. This is a mix of a paperwork filter just to make sure, did you fill out the application correctly, but also, do you at first blush broadly align with our regional policies in terms of ensuring that a project is on certain priority corridors, that it in general is built to complete street standards, and a few other metrics for street and transit projects, just broadly making sure that these are good projects. Then we have KDP2. This is our technical data-informed project evaluation. schema where we are able to rank and score projects against one another. And we'll get into more detail on this in a moment. Then we have KDP3, which we call our final factors. This tends to include items that we cannot properly quantify in our more data-informed and technical evaluation. So geographic equity, making sure that projects are spread around the region, making sure that counties that tend to have more resources to submit very good applications don't get all of the projects, that we can look at projects in certain parts of our region that historically have had underinvestment and see if they still have good projects that they have submitted to us. Consider demographic and equity factors that were not properly considered in KDP2, and of course, project deliverability. Is a city or county able to deliver this project within a short amount of time? And then we have our funding decisions of, for those projects we want to fund, which buckets of funding are we going to fund them from? Next slide. We have 4 major score criteria for all of the projects that we consider. So regardless of project type, this could be an active mode project, a roadway project, a transit or state of good repair project. These are the 4 main criteria that we consider for all of them: mobility and access, equity, safety, and resiliency. These are the 4 major criteria that have bubbled up over the past few years that are major concerns within the ARC region. And what we have seen from the new federal infrastructure law and guidance from the US DOT is that this is also what the federal government wants to consider, that these are the 4 main buckets of ideas and items that we should really be digging into for all of our transportation projects. Next slide. I've mentioned project types. So one core project type we have is bicycle and pedestrian projects. These are new sidewalks, sidewalk extensions, neighborhood greenways, bike lanes, cycle tracks, things like that cater to pedestrians and bike riders. We like to have our projects in discrete project type buckets so that we can compare like projects to like projects, so that we can compare a sidewalk or bike lane project in one part of the region to another sidewalk or bike lane project in another part of the region. We don't want a bike lane project that carries 30 people per day to go up against a highway project that will carry 3,000 people or cars per day, because that seems an inequity and infeasibility in just the comparison structure. So we separate these things out. Briefly, these are how we weigh and score each of the main 4 project score criteria and the sub-criteria that help build those. So for mobility and access, we want to consider how many people will this serve and how does it connect to existing networks of other sidewalks, other bike lanes that are already in existence or will soon be in existence? Do these help first and last mile trips from transit connections? And does it improve access to destinations, not only at either end of a corridor, but along those corridors? So a 1-mile sidewalk project that connects 2 neighborhoods at either side and then a lot of retail and businesses along it, we consider all of those as stops and destinations that people can go to and from. Equity is addressed in 2 major ways. One is the demographics of the census tracts that these projects exist in. So we consider the income, ethnic, and racial demographics of those regions and give more points to those regions that have minority representation or historically underserved demographics, and promotes housing affordability. Does this have potential to serve areas that have subsidized housing in it? Safety is a broad term, as we all know, but we look at not only the proven safety countermeasures that are included in a project's design, but the overall design of a project and its ability to address both existing safety concerns within that corridor, and especially for vulnerable road users, but also if a brand new network is being built, is it built to the highest safety standards that we currently understand? Resiliency considers 2 things. 1, green infrastructure. Do these projects include elements that can help mitigate or adapt to water events? So heavy rains or flooding. We score this relatively low for bicycle and pedestrian projects because they do tend to have a small footprint compared to, say, a road or bridge project, but still scored because there is potential for a very green bicycle or pedestrian project. And reduction of air pollutants. We roughly model what the potential mode shifts could be of people who are driving to people who will instead walk or bike along these corridors, and thereby what is the reduction in air pollutants from that mode shift. So we roughly score that. Next slide. One of our project types is also multi-use trails. Our distinction between bicycle and pedestrian projects and trail projects is typically how much of this project is off-road, how much does it deviate from the current existing road network. Those projects that have most of their area outside of a road network on greenfield paths or a rail trail path, those are multi-use trails. Most of our scoring metrics are very similar to our bike ped projects. One of the major differences is in our network connectivity. We want to make sure that these connect to not only existing bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in terms of sidewalks and bike lanes, but that this helps to further our regional trail vision that Byron showed you a few slides earlier. So we highly prioritize those projects that help to expand or connect to that wider regional plan. Next slide. And just as an overview, a lot of what we talked about today, we pulled from these two major documents. So Walk, Bike, Thrive is our major bicycle and pedestrian active mode planning document that we have generated. And then we have our TIP project evaluation framework that we colloquially call the cookbook. And that's where we pulled a lot of the scoring and ranking information from for these presentations. And these are both pretty foundational texts for how we evaluate and plan projects within the Atlanta region. The TIP project evaluation framework went through a recent update as of last year, and that document that we are trying to continually update and iterate on as we understand more of the needs, wants, and desires within our region. Right. Thank you, everyone.
And I'll add on top of Page's there that that's another place that advocacy can be very effective. I think there's a difference, and we've heard a little bit in the conversation this afternoon about navigating the process versus changing the policy. And I think those are two different, those are different goals with different levels of effort. But having conversations, and we have a transportation equity working group that comments on that cookbook TIP prioritization document before we approve it. And the folks on that committee, have a lot of influence over the scoring criteria, which are very technical and boring. I love it, but I understand not everybody does. But that really influences and shapes when we get project applications, how we can build the TIP from that. So there are neighborhood groups who want a specific project and they're very effective at working that through the process. And there's other groups who really want to see a more just, a more equitable, or a more sustainable transportation system. And they really work with us on those policy goals. And both are very effective and very helpful in how we do our work.
So thank you for that. I want to invite folks to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. But before we get there, I just want to ask, I guess this is for all the speakers. We've heard about TIPs, we've heard about long range plans, and we've heard about local plans. Can you talk a little bit about how those three work together?
Caron, I'll say the slides that I have and the graphics that I have are they're simplified and they're also very ideal. We would love for that neatly nested hierarchy of a county transportation plan prioritizes 5 projects. 3 of those projects navigate into the long range transportation plan. 1 of those projects navigates into an upcoming TIP and then gets built. In reality, it's much messier than that. And we have projects that come from left field that we've never heard of before, get TIP applications. We can't find any source document on them. So really, at the end of the day, the work that Tejas and I do and our MPO peers around the country do is trying to navigate all of that spaghetti jumble of different inputs and processes. And it really helps to have projects that have had some local planning done. We have a better cost estimate. We have a better right-of-way alignment estimate. We have a better idea for environmental barriers that that projects might face in the federal funding process. And projects that have a well-developed foundation tend to be more competitive and do better when it comes time for federal funding. And we've only talked about TIPs. We haven't talked about USDOT discretionary grants, which is an entirely different channel. But projects that have been well thought out tend to do better because we know more about them. And in fact, we have a funding stream that we occasionally divert projects that sound useful but have not been well thought through. We can assign them scoping money at a planning phase to kind of allow local governments and their community members to have the time they need to kind of build that project vision. So we would love for it to be a neatly nested sequential process, but in reality, it's a huge jumble of decades of legacy projects that are all bouncing around, and we have to sort through how to get them into a coherent region.
So I would just say that, in my region, the city of Philadelphia is very poor, doesn't have very much resources, so its capital program is very small. And so it's important, one way is that you look at the capital program and then you see what they have asked to put on their tip, like to sort of what they've sort of taken over and said, okay, let's use federal money and spend it there. Other regions probably work very differently. I would say that it's understanding your local government's capital program for transportation and then seeing of those projects, what's being put on the tip to use federal money. The tip is there just to figure out how to spend federal money. And some localities, it's a whole nother webinar, don't want to have anything to do with federal money because it's so expensive and burdensome, and it takes 10 years to get any project from start to finish.
I love what the other two speakers
Echo
added
Sarah's
in.
point that there's an advocacy element to this as well too, that for years, the city of Atlanta as the core city in our region saw the MPO board as the counties. It was the counties thing. That's where county commissioners went. We gave money to counties kind of automatically. And it has taken local advocates really pressuring the mayor and the city council president, who both have automatic standing seats on our board, to say, go down to ARC and participate in that conversation. Don't let a big, well-funded, well-financed, and skilled county pull down that money every single year. Now, our counties also do great bike ped projects, and we support them in doing that. But when it comes to regional equity and the balance between suburban and urban investments, advocates kind of, there's a role to say, get your elected officials to really participate in the process and not turn their back on it automatically.
Scott?
I'd like just to add in quickly, it's really depends on where you live, which the point has been made very eloquently today. In my jurisdiction, the long range plans set the vision. There's not a lot of detail. It's graphic in nature. It's a line on the map with some ideals to be implemented. To move that project forward, majority of the time, it is local funding, and the MPO has a role, but the local government has a much greater role of how to implement that project. And that's where advocates can be very helpful of identifying specific items that are needed. I think it was Sarah who brought up a great point. A lot of the things we're discussing today have to do with federal funding. Federal funding is used on specific types of projects, but local government will strategize when is it better to use federal funding versus local funding, because federal funding brings with it additional requirements in order to utilize it. And so from my perspective, obviously I'm biased on local government. Every part of the process has a value. You need to figure out whether the particular thing you're advocating for? Is it best for you to talk to the MPO, or is it more advantageous for you to talk to the local government? And depending upon the region where you live, that answer is different.
Yeah, and the other thing I heard was it depends on the size of the project that you're looking at.
There is an element to that for locally for federal funds in terms of the TA program. We utilize those pretty frequently for trail connections and pedestrian bridges. So construction value less than $1 million. If you're talking about your local arterial street that, 35 miles an hour, and you want to know where's the bike lane, that is all local government. We fund that locally. We make those decisions locally.
Thanks. So we're at the hour. I just want to give a quick summary of what I heard and then ask the speakers if you have one last comment, which is regardless of which plan, get involved early, get to know the folks who are making the decisions. And I heard also, look at that long range plan, get in the vision, and that think about the tip as federal money, and maybe you can go to local plans for local money. Any final words for advocates?
Get
Involved.
from us or for us?
From you, for everyone on the phone.
There's lots and lots of opportunity, and I have a couple colleagues on the call here, and I really do think that breaking through into surface transportation block grants is the goal. That's where you got to go. You got to get the big money for big projects. Otherwise, you're building things like 1 mile at a time. We're not going to get there with a big connected network with doing that. So it's going to take a while. And Patrick and I have been at this for, I hate to say 10 years, but you learn more and more every year, and you make mistakes and you miss opportunities, and then you strike it, and it's really great.
Yeah, I'll just add that we've talked about a lot of different ways to get involved, lots of different meetings and organizations and committees that advocates can talk to and about. Depending on which project and which phase of a project you want to really advocate for, it's important to understand which of those committees, which of those timelines you need to be most involved in. For smaller, very local projects, it's your city or county government that really needs to be advocated for and with. If it is a larger regional vision, yes, that can be very useful for an MPO board. So it's just making sure you maximize the limited time that advocates have and the limited time that these political and policy boards have.
Thanks. Prioritization. Besides project, anything else?
I'll say to that point, public agencies defend themselves by being boring and dull and taking forever to make decisions. And so I think all of the presenters today have mentioned it, like just get to know your local staff people. Like I'm usually pretty easy to get in touch with in the metro area, and I'm happy to either have a conversation about a project or navigate the process, or give people kind of an idea for which meeting might be really important to be at, or which one might be the end of the year holiday cookie swap. So
great, thank you. So I just want to say thanks again to all our speakers. Thanks to everyone for joining us. This is a confusing process, but it's a really important one to help us be part of the future, or help plan what our communities and transportation systems look like in the future. Thank you, everyone.